Africa's future, particularly in matters of peace and security, cannot be outsourced.
African leaders are now following the lead of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, forming a united front to take back control through a brand new alliance called ISCA. But why are they abandoning the West and rallying behind one man's vision? Let's find out. Before there was a movement, before there was ISCA, just one man was standing in defiance. In 2022, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't a household name. He was a relatively unknown military captain in Burkina Faso, young, unassuming, disciplined. But behind that calm exterior was a deeply strategic mind, shaped by years of witnessing foreign interventions that promised peace and delivered nothing. While international troops flooded the Sahel and drone strikes turned villages into craters, the people of Burkina Faso were still dying. The nation, like much of Africa, had outsourced its security and paid the price in blood. Then Traoré made a move that shocked even his closest allies. He overthrew the existing regime not just to seize power, but to end the illusion of sovereignty. Overnight, foreign forces were ordered out. Military bases tied to Western intelligence networks were dismantled. The government stopped asking for permission and started taking control. And most notably, Traoré announced the creation of a national war school, a bold institution dedicated to training elite soldiers, not in Western doctrines, but in African warfare, history, and strategy. This was unheard of. While most leaders clung to security partnerships with France, the US, or the UN, Traoré did the unthinkable. He rejected them all. He didn't just want better weapons. He wanted a new mindset. His soldiers weren't being taught how to fight like NATO officers. They were studying resistance movements, guerrilla warfare in African forests, and the legacy of African revolutionaries like Samora Machel and Thomas Sankara. They were being taught to see Africa as something worth dying for, not just defending. To the outside world, this seemed reckless, but to many within the continent, it was electric. Traoré wasn't asking for permission. He was building a new model, quietly, confidently, and without compromise. Soon, other African leaders began watching closely. His speeches about African pride weren't just slogans, they were policies. His rejection of foreign aid wasn't just posturing, it was backed by alternative partnerships with non-Western powers. He was investing in weapons manufacturing, agriculture, and surveillance tech using local resources. In less than a year, Burkina Faso transformed from a dependent war zone into a symbol of what independence could look like. More importantly, his people stood with him. Traoré walked through the streets of Ouagadougou without a wall of bodyguards. Youth groups rallied for him. Artists painted murals of him. And in cafes and classrooms across Africa, his name began to surface, not as a dictator, but as a liberator. This lone defiance slowly morphed into something more dangerous to the status quo. It became contagious. In Mali and Niger, juntas that once acted in isolation began adopting similar rhetoric. Civil societies in Senegal and Ghana started questioning why their soldiers were trained under foreign officers. Across WhatsApp groups and Pan-African forums, one name echoed louder than the rest: Traoré. He didn't start a campaign. He didn't seek followers. But by refusing to kneel, he gave everyone else a reason to stand. And as admiration turned into imitation, something inevitable began brewing in the background. The realization that if so many nations felt the same frustration, maybe it was time to meet. Not in Europe, not through a Western NGO, but in Africa, on African terms, with African goals. And that's exactly what happened next. Once Captain Traoré lit the fuse in Ouagadougou, something subtle, but revolutionary began to ripple across the continent. African leaders weren't publicly declaring allegiance to his philosophy, at least not at first. But behind closed doors, cabinet briefings began to shift. Intelligence agencies started auditing their partnerships. Defense ministers began to question whether the West's support was just surveillance in disguise. It wasn't a formal alliance, it was a quiet conspiracy of reflection. Across capitals like Accra, Bamako, and even Pretoria, leaders saw something they couldn't ignore. Traoré's approach was working. His expulsion of Western troops didn't plunge his country into chaos as predicted. Instead, Burkina Faso's domestic military operations became more focused, more precise, and, most shockingly, more popular. And his local war school wasn't just pumping out soldiers, it was producing ideologues. Officers who didn't dream of serving in NATO drills or UN peacekeeping deployments, but of rewriting the very foundations of African defense. This struck a nerve. Most African militaries, though funded and trained by foreign donors, were still plagued by low morale and high desertion. Their missions often served foreign intelligence goals, not national stability. Many leaders knew this. They just didn't say it aloud. But watching a young captain in landlocked Burkina Faso flip the table made them ask the one forbidden question: what if we don't need them at all? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The silence began to break in late 2024. Mali, already on its path after distancing itself from France, accelerated its military reforms, pulling troops into new national training academies and forming joint drills with neighbors. In Guinea, high-ranking officers praised Traoré's doctrine without mentioning his name, while in Chad, civil society groups petitioned the government to review all military cooperation agreements with the West. But it wasn't just presidents and soldiers watching Traoré, it was the youth. The street-level anger that once focused on poverty and corruption was morphing into a sharper critique. Foreign occupation masked as assistance. In university campuses and rural towns alike, a Pan-African political awakening was unfolding. TikTok creators broke down speeches from Traoré. Radio programs debated the role of France in Sahelian instability. Young Africans weren't just admiring his defiance, they were demanding it from their governments. At this point, what had started as imitation became something else: coordination. A string of behind-the-scenes meetings took place across the continent. Delegations traveled quietly between West African states. Military advisors began sharing notes on doctrine, drone tech, and counterinsurgency tactics rooted in local experience, not US or French manuals. South-South cooperation, long touted in theory, was now emerging in real-time practice. But admiration alone could not build a future. These leaders, no matter how aligned ideologically, were still fragmented, separated by languages, borders, and the lingering scars of colonial division. What they needed now wasn't just similar ideas. They needed a common table. They needed a forum that didn't carry the fingerprints of Washington, Paris, or Brussels. One that would be fully African in location, composition, and ambition. A place to turn shared frustration into a collective strategy. And so, after months of silent planning, one name was whispered louder and louder behind diplomatic walls: Rwanda. Stable, fiercely independent, and no stranger to post-genocide security reform, Kigali offered not only symbolic power, but logistical confidence. By early 2025, the pieces were in place. The admiration for Traoré had transformed into a continental intention. And on May 19, 2025, that intention would become real. They called it ISCA. When the doors opened at Kigali Convention Center on May 19, 2025, something unprecedented was already in motion. For the first time in decades, African leaders had gathered, not under the supervision of a foreign peacekeeping mission, not under the umbrella of the UN or African Union driven by donor agendas, but under their banner, with their terms. The International Security Conference on Africa, ISCA, wasn't just a meeting, it was a statement. A statement that Africa was finally ready to confront its security future, without being told how. The hall was filled with presidents, military chiefs, intelligence officers, civil society leaders, and observers from the diaspora. What made it historic wasn't just who was in the room, but who wasn't. There were no Western diplomats, no EU security envoys, no American military attachés are quietly steering the agenda. For once, the conversation was purely African, and that absence said more than any keynote speech could. Each delegate knew exactly why they were there. The conversations weren't theoretical. From Nigeria's fight against Boko Haram to Mozambique's battle in Cabo Delgado, from Mali's resistance movements to Somalia's fragile government, every nation had felt the sting of insecurity worsened, not improved by foreign help. The leaders didn't arrive to diagnose the problem. They came because they had seen a solution. And that solution had already begun in Burkina Faso. Inside the conference rooms, One theme echoed again and again: self-determination through security. Delegates discussed coordinated intelligence frameworks that would bypass Western surveillance and avoid intelligence leaks to non-African powers. Panelists proposed joint African operations, not just in response to attacks, but in proactive defense of key regions like the Sahel, the Horn, and the Congo Basin. But perhaps the most symbolic shift of all was linguistic. For the first time, policy papers were drafted in Swahili, Arabic, Hausa, and Amharic alongside English and French. It was more than a linguistic gesture. It was a rejection of colonial defaults, a reaffirmation that this was an African conversation, not one being translated for foreign ears. The presence of civilian leaders and youth activists was another powerful break from tradition. Unlike previous security summits dominated by generals in decorated uniforms, ISCA gave space to the people most affected by Africa's wars, its citizens, survivors of insurgent violence, journalists silenced by foreign-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Students are demanding an end to neo-colonial military pacts. Their inclusion made one thing clear: Africa's security crisis was not just military, it was existential. Among the key proposals was the establishment of a continental rapid response force, funded and trained by African nations to be deployed in emergencies without needing UN approval. Another groundbreaking idea: the creation of a unified defense academy system, inspired by Traoré's model, where African officers from different regions could train under a shared doctrine based on African history, culture, and warfare, not Cold War textbooks. There was even talk of developing a sovereign defense technology fund, allowing states to co-invest in drone surveillance, cybersecurity, and indigenous weapons manufacturing, an ambitious alternative to buying overpriced equipment from former colonial powers. But while the energy in the room was electric, the challenges were real. Leaders spoke frankly about distrust among African states, lingering language barriers, and dependency traps still embedded in procurement and logistics. Yet the will to move forward was unmistakable. By the end of the second day, the symbolic had become tangible. ISCA was no longer an idea. It had structures, resolutions, and roadmaps. Rwanda's role as host had set the tone: efficient, unapologetic, and local. But the vision, that belonged to the continent. And yet, everyone knew bold declarations wouldn't be enough. If ISCA wanted to become more than just a diplomatic milestone, it needed systems, structure, and strategy. The next step was clear: building a defense architecture as independent as the ideas that inspired it. The first step was creating permanent structures. ISCA wasn't meant to be another one-off summit with beautiful resolutions that faded within weeks. Delegates agreed to form a permanent security secretariat, a centralized body that would coordinate intelligence, training standards, and military deployments between member states. This wasn't the African Union Redux. It would operate outside of traditional AU frameworks, with a tighter, more agile bureaucracy. Membership was voluntary, but conditional. No dual allegiance with Western military programs. The headquarters, already under construction in Ouagadougou. Traoré had offered land, security, and full digital integration for its operations. For many, this was poetic: a war-ravaged country now hosting the brain of Africa's defense evolution. Beyond administration, ISCA's architects turned to the battlefield. A revolutionary idea was gaining traction: the establishment of joint regional command zones. East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and the Sahel would each host a standing regional force capable of rapid deployment within 72 hours of any emerging threat. These wouldn't be massive national armies, but lean, coordinated units trained under the same doctrine, using compatible systems and answering to a regional council, not foreign embassies. But what doctrine would they follow? Here, Traoré's earlier innovation found a continental echo. ISCA ratified the plan to build a Pan-African War College network, linked military academies that would replace foreign-funded officer training. Instead of sending cadets to France or the UK, countries would now exchange instructors, develop African-centered curricula, and study the failures of foreign-led interventions. Courses would include not only counterinsurgency and defense logistics, but also African military history, psychological operations, and anti-colonial theory. Soldiers would learn from past betrayals, not repeat them. A key element in this new architecture was technology. African militaries were tired of relying on foreign drones that came with surveillance backdoors or required satellite links to Washington. So, ISCA announced the launch of the Continental Defense Tech Initiative, a fund backed by member states to co-develop African-made surveillance drones, encryption software, and battlefield robotics. Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia pledged their engineering universities and tech startups to the project. The aim wasn't just cost savings, it was digital sovereignty. To support all this, ISCA committed to creating the African Sovereign Defense Fund, a pooled reserve of currency and resources that could finance emergency deployments, equipment, and logistics without needing Western grants. This would be funded by redirecting a percentage of extractive industry taxes, gold, cobalt, oil, into a secure, independent account overseen by a civilian audited board. The principle was simple. If Africa's minerals are being exploited, they should at least be used to protect Africans. Yet every structure built still faced the elephant in the room: fragmentation. Colonial languages, border disputes, and national egos remained. Delegates acknowledged this, but they agreed that coordination didn't require total homogenization. It required trust. So ISCA launched a military-to-military trust-building initiative, including annual joint drills, officer exchanges, and conflict de-escalation frameworks between historically tense nations. By the time the working groups disbanded, Africa was no longer waiting for security to be delivered from abroad. It was crafting a continental shield, one wire, drone, doctrine, and bullet at a time. But the shield needed more than blueprints. It needed something even harder to obtain: financial independence. Because no fortress can stand if it's built with borrowed bricks. And that's where the next battle begins. Blueprints had been drawn, command centers proposed, a new doctrine had found its voice. But as the dust settled after the Kigali conference, a sobering truth hung in the air. Africa cannot defend itself with borrowed money. This realization wasn't new, but ISCA forced it into the spotlight. Every visionary plan drafted in Kigali came with a price tag: drones, war colleges, training exchanges, regional deployments. None of it could survive on passion alone. And this time, the usual donors wouldn't foot the bill. Many of them were watching nervously, understanding that ISCA was more than just a summit. It was a breakaway movement, a declaration of independence that threatened the power balance of every military agreement the West had with Africa. The continent had a choice to make: keep begging for protection, or start paying for sovereignty. It was Traoré himself who had offered a model for this next battle. Months before ISCA, he began diverting a portion of Burkina Faso's gold revenues into a sovereign defense fund. He ended French mining concessions and replaced them with state-controlled contracts. This wasn't just about reclaiming resources, it was about creating a war chest for independence. He proved that it could be done, even in a landlocked nation under siege. ISCA now aimed to scale that idea continent-wide. The first proposal on the table was a Pan-African Strategic Resource Levy, a policy that would redirect a small percentage of profits from extractive industries into a shared defense fund. For decades, Africa's gold, oil, uranium, cobalt, and lithium had filled the treasuries of foreign nations. Now, ISCA wanted to reverse the flow. If a company mined Congolese cobalt, it would pay into the fund that protects Congolese soil. If Nigerian oil flowed, it would fuel more than just pipelines. It would fund defense infrastructure, local manufacturing of weapons, and real-time intelligence systems. But there was resistance. Multinational corporations, particularly those with deep ties to Western governments, lobbied against the idea almost immediately. Threats of investment pullout and legal retaliation began to circulate. But ISCA leaders anticipated this. They proposed an economic contingency network, a coalition of BRICS-aligned and Global South investors willing to step in where Western financiers threatened exit. China, already active in African infrastructure, expressed informal interest in backing local arms production and telecommunications defense systems under strict African ownership clauses. Still, ISCA wanted more than substitutes. It wanted full autonomy. Leaders debate launching Africa's first defense sovereign bond, a financial instrument sold to African citizens and diaspora communities. Imagine an African in Paris or Toronto buying a $1,000 bond not just to invest, but to protect the continent's right to defend itself. It wasn't just financial, it was emotional, a patriotic stake in sovereignty. Then came the biggest proposal of all, the creation of a Pan-African Defense Bank. This institution would be modeled not after the World Bank or IMF, but after Africa's own security needs. Flexible lending for defense innovation, infrastructure, and emergency response, independent of foreign oversight. It would provide long-term funding for war colleges, drone factories, and cyber defense units without waiting for annual Western approvals or conditions that compromise national interests. Yet for all these plans, the question remains, will African governments commit? Talking about financial sovereignty is easy when cameras are on. But when donor nations cut aid in retaliation or mining giants withhold payments, will leaders hold the line? ISCA's answer was clear. Freedom has always had a cost. The only question is whether Africa is finally willing to pay it. And if so, this won't just be a security revolution. It will be an economic and psychological liberation. No more waiting for UN blue helmets. No more signing peace deals written in foreign tongues. No more wars fought with someone else's money and someone else's motives. For the first time in centuries, Africa is learning how to defend itself with its own hands, its mind, and now, its own money. The age of permission is ending. The age of possession has begun. Do you think following Traoré would save other African nations? Let us know in the comment section. How far will these efforts go? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.